What if I told you that a waitress with a worn sketchbook saved thousands of children's lives at 3 o'clock in the morning? What if I told you that a billionaire CEO lost everything he'd worked for in a single moment and found something far more valuable in the last place he expected? This is a true story about the night when desperation met purpose in a small coffee shop. About a mother who couldn't save her own son, until a stranger walked through her door with tears in his eyes and hope slipping through his fingers. Stay with me, because what happens next will remind you that miracles don't come from the sky. They come from ordinary people who show up at exactly the right moment. And by the end of this story, you'll never look at a coffee shop the same way again. This is the story of how one lost presentation changed everything. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. You know those moments in life when everything you've worked for seems to crumble right before your eyes? When all your plans, all your dreams, all those sleepless nights suddenly mean nothing because of one terrible mistake. Let me tell you about a night that changed everything for a man named David. David was 41 years old, and he'd spent the last decade building something beautiful. He owned a technology company that created special learning programs for children with dyslexia. You see, David himself had struggled with reading as a child. He remembered the shame, the frustration, the feeling of being left behind while other kids seemed to breeze through their schoolwork. So when he grew up and learned about technology, he made it his mission to help kids like him. His company, Bright Path Learning, had grown from a tiny apartment project into something that reached thousands of schools. But David wanted more. He wanted to change everything. He'd spent 3 years developing a revolutionary new program that could adapt to each child's unique learning style in real time. It was like having a personal tutor that never got tired, never got frustrated, and always knew exactly how to help. Tonight was supposed to be the night before his greatest triumph. Tomorrow morning, he would present this program to the National Education Board. If they approved it, his software would go into schools across the entire country. Millions of children who struggled with reading could finally have the help they desperately needed. But as David sat in his office on the 38th floor, staring at his computer screen, his whole world was collapsing. The presentation file was gone. Just gone. 3 years of work, hundreds of demonstrations, every chart, every graph, every carefully chosen word that would convince the board to say yes. All of it had vanished into nothing. His hands were shaking as he tried everything he could think of. He checked the trash folder. He searched every backup drive. He called his IT specialist, who was on vacation 3 states away. Nothing worked. The file was corrupted beyond repair, and the backup he thought he'd saved? He'd accidentally overwritten it just an hour ago when his mind was foggy with exhaustion. The meeting was in 7 hours. 7 hours to somehow recreate 3 years of work. David wasn't the kind of man who cried easily, but tonight, alone in that empty office building, he felt tears burning in his eyes. This wasn't just about business anymore. Last month, he'd met a little girl named Sophie at a school demonstration. She was 8 years old, and she'd whispered to him with tears in her eyes, "I'm not stupid, am I?" Her mother had explained that Sophie spent hours every night trying to read simple sentences, getting so frustrated that she'd throw her books across the room. David had knelt down and told Sophie the truth. He told her that he'd been just like her once, that his brain just worked differently, and that was okay. He promised her that he was working on something that would help. He promised her. And now he was going to break that promise. He thought about calling the education board and canceling, but he knew they'd assembled members from different cities just for this presentation. They'd cleared their schedules, made travel arrangements, gathered their top experts. If he canceled now, they'd never give him another chance. There were other companies developing similar programs, and time wasn't something struggling children had in abundance. David loosened his tie and walked to the window. The city stretched out below him, lights twinkling like a blanket of stars on the ground. Somewhere down there, children were crying over homework they couldn't understand. Parents were feeling helpless, watching their bright, creative kids believe they were failures just because reading didn't come easily. He remembered something his grandfather used to tell him when he was young and struggling with his schoolwork. "David," he'd say in that warm, gravelly voice, "sometimes the answer isn't in working harder. Sometimes it's in opening your eyes to see the help that's right in front of you." David grabbed his jacket and his car keys. He couldn't stay in this office anymore. Maybe a drive would clear his head. Maybe some fresh air would help him think. Maybe nothing would help, but he had to try something. The elevator ride down felt endless. The parking garage was cold and empty, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls. As he sat in his car, key in the ignition, he had no idea where he was going. He just knew he needed to move, needed to breathe, needed to be somewhere that didn't remind him of his failure. He started driving with no destination in mind, just following the streets wherever they led. The city looked different at night. Quieter. More honest somehow. During the day, everything moved so fast, everyone rushing somewhere important. But at night, you could see the real heart of the city. The small shops. The dim streetlights. The ordinary places where ordinary people lived their lives. David didn't believe in fate or destiny or any of that. He believed in hard work and dedication and building something meaningful through your own effort. But sometimes, don't you think the universe has a way of putting us exactly where we need to be at exactly the right moment? He was about to discover that miracles don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they look like a simple coffee shop on a quiet corner. Sometimes they wear an apron and ask if you'd like cream with your coffee. Sometimes the answer to our most desperate prayers comes from the most unexpected person at the most impossible time. And sometimes, when we're at our lowest point, that's exactly when we're ready to receive the help we never knew we needed. Have you ever walked into a place and immediately felt like you could breathe again? That's what happened when David spotted the little coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Main Street. Rosa's coffee house wasn't fancy. It was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years, with checkered floors and vinyl booths that had been patched more times than anyone could count. But warm light glowed through the windows, cutting through the cold darkness of the street, and David found himself pulling over without really deciding to. The bell above the door made a gentle chiming sound as he walked in. The smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon wrapped around him like a warm blanket. There were only a few people inside. An older gentleman reading a worn paperback in the corner. 2 young women laughing quietly over their laptops. And behind the counter, a woman who looked to be in her late 40s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Her name tag said Grace, and when she looked up at David, she smiled the kind of smile that makes you feel like someone actually sees you. Not the professional mask people wear at work, but a real, genuine expression of kindness. "Coffee, sweetheart?" she asked, and her voice had a musical quality to it, warm and comforting. "Please," David said, sliding onto one of the counter stools. He felt exhausted down to his bones. "Actually, make it a large. I'm going to be up all night anyway." Grace studied his face as she poured the coffee, and David had the strange feeling she could read the desperation written all over him. "Rough night?" she asked gently. David let out a laugh that held no humor at all. "You could say that. I just lost the most important presentation of my life. 3 years of work gone. And I have to present it to a board of education officials tomorrow morning." He paused, surprised at himself. He never talked about his problems with strangers. He was the boss, the leader, the one who always had it together. But something about this quiet coffee shop and this kind woman made him feel like he could be honest for once. "I'm sorry," he added quickly. "You probably don't want to hear about my disasters." Grace set the coffee cup down in front of him and leaned against the counter. "Honey, people have been bringing their troubles to coffee shops since coffee was invented. It's what we're here for. Tell me about this presentation. What was it about?" There was something in her voice that made David actually look at her, really look at her. She wasn't just being polite. She genuinely cared. "It's a learning program," he said slowly, "for children with dyslexia. Kids who struggle with reading and feel stupid even though they're not. The program adapts to each child's needs, helps them learn at their own pace, in their own way." Grace's hand stopped moving on the coffee pot. Her eyes widened slightly, and David saw something shift in her expression. Pain. Recognition. Understanding. "Dyslexia," she repeated softly. "You're developing something to help kids with dyslexia." "Yes. Do you know about it?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My son, Daniel. He's 13 years old, and he has dyslexia." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Of all the coffee shops in this entire city, of all the people David could have met tonight, he'd walked into the one place where someone understood exactly why his lost presentation mattered so desperately. If this story is touching your heart, I hope you'll stay with us to see what happens next. Grace took a deep breath and continued. "Daniel is brilliant. He can build anything with his hands. He understands how machines work just by looking at them. He's kind and funny and creative. But every single night, we sit at the kitchen table for hours while he tries to read his homework. He cries, David. My 13-year-old son cries because he thinks he's stupid. Because other kids can do in 20 minutes what takes him 2 hours. Because no matter how hard he tries, the words just don't make sense the way they should. David felt his throat tighten. He knew that story. He'd lived that story. The school tries to help, Grace went on, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. But they have 30 kids in a class and 1 teacher. Daniel gets pulled out for special help twice a week, but it's not enough. He's starting to give up, David. I can see it happening. He's starting to believe he really is stupid, and I don't know how to convince him otherwise. He's not stupid, David said firmly. His brain just works differently. That's not a weakness, Grace. It's just different. I know that. You know that. But try telling that to a 13-year-old boy who watches his younger sister breeze through books he can't even start. Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down on the stool next to David. You said you lost your presentation. Tell me about the program. Maybe talking through it will help you remember the details. David looked at her uncertainly. Grace, it's really technical. There are graphs and data points and neural learning patterns. She held up her hand and smiled, though her eyes were still sad. Honey, when your child has a learning disability, you become an expert real fast. I've read every book, attended every workshop, talked to every specialist I could find. Try me. And so David started talking. At first hesitantly, then with growing confidence as he realized Grace really did understand. She asked intelligent questions, made insightful comments, and listened with an intensity that made him remember details he thought he'd forgotten. Have you ever met someone and felt like maybe you were supposed to meet them all along? Like some invisible thread had been pulling you both to the same place at the same time? For the next hour, David talked while Grace listened and asked questions that showed she understood far more than most people would. She brought him refill after refill of coffee and a slice of homemade lemon cake, treating him less like a customer and more like a friend who needed help. The other customers gradually left. The older gentleman finished his book and waved goodnight. The 2 young women packed up their laptops and headed home. But David and Grace barely noticed. They were deep in conversation about learning patterns, neural pathways, and the specific ways dyslexic brains process information differently. The breakthrough came, David explained, sketching rough diagrams on napkins, when we stopped trying to make dyslexic children read like everyone else. Instead, we let the program adapt to their natural learning style. Some kids learn better with audio support. Some need different fonts or background colors. Some need the text broken into smaller chunks. The program figures out what works for each individual child and adjusts automatically. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Like finding the right key for the right lock. You're not changing the lock, you're just finding what opens it. Exactly. David felt a surge of excitement despite his exhaustion. That's exactly it. You just described in one sentence what took me 3 pages to explain in the presentation. Grace smiled, but then her expression grew serious. David, I need to tell you something. And I don't want you to think I'm crazy or that I'm overstepping. What is it? She stood up and walked to a shelf behind the counter, pulling down a worn sketchbook. When she returned and opened it, David's eyes widened. The pages were filled with beautiful drawings. Educational diagrams. Charts showing learning progressions. Visual representations of complex educational concepts. All done in careful, artistic detail. Before I opened this coffee shop, Grace said quietly, I was an educational consultant. I worked with schools to develop visual learning materials for children with special needs. I specialized in dyslexia because... She paused, her voice catching. Because I have it too. I understand from the inside what these kids go through. David stared at her, his mind racing. You're an educational consultant? I was. I gave it up 5 years ago when my husband passed away suddenly. I needed something simpler, something stable, so I took my savings and bought this coffee shop. It pays the bills and lets me be there for Daniel. She looked down at her sketchbook. But I never lost the skills. And I never stopped learning about how to help kids like him. Like us. David felt something shift inside his chest. It was like the universe had reached down and placed exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Grace, he said slowly, what if I told you that you've already helped me remember most of the key points of my presentation? And what if I asked, would you be willing to help me recreate it? Not just the information, but the visual elements too. Grace looked at him for a long moment, and David saw something light up in her eyes. Hope. Purpose. The chance to use her gifts to help not just her own son, but thousands of children like him. "How much time do we have?" she asked. David checked his watch. 5 hours until I need to leave for the meeting. Then we'd better get started. What happened over the next hours was something David would remember for the rest of his life. Grace flipped to a fresh page in her sketchbook and began to draw. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone returning to work they loved, work they were born to do. She didn't just recreate his charts and graphs. She made them better. She understood both the technical side and the human side, and she brought them together in ways that would make people not just understand the program, but feel why it mattered. "This chart showing reading improvement," she said, sketching quickly, "needs to include actual quotes from children. Numbers are important, but stories change hearts. This diagram of the neural learning process," she continued, adding color and detail, "should show a child's face. Remind them that we're talking about real kids, not just data points." David watched in amazement as his presentation was reborn before his eyes. But it wasn't just being recreated. It was being transformed into something more powerful than what he'd lost. Grace brought a perspective he'd never had. She knew what it felt like to struggle. She knew what parents needed to hear. She knew how to make the science feel human and the hope feel real. They worked through the night, barely noticing as the hours passed. Grace drew while David provided the technical details and the research data. He told her about the pilot programs, the success stories, the children whose lives had already been changed. She turned each fact into a visual story that would touch hearts as well as minds. Around 3 a.m, Grace paused and looked at what they'd created. 28 hand-drawn pages, each one a perfect blend of scientific accuracy and artistic heart. "You know what Daniel told me last week," she said softly. "He said he wants to drop out of school. 13 years old, and he's already given up hope. But if this program gets approved," her voice broke, "if this gets into schools, maybe he'll have a chance. Maybe he'll see that there's nothing wrong with him, that he can learn and succeed just like anyone else." David felt tears in his own eyes. "Grace, I can't thank you enough. You've given me more than a presentation tonight. You've reminded me why this matters." As dawn light began creeping through the coffee shop windows, they had created something neither of them could have made alone. Sometimes miracles happen when two people's needs meet at exactly the right moment. Sometimes the help we desperately need comes from someone who needs our help just as much. Have you ever walked into a room knowing that the next few hours would change everything? That's how David felt as he entered the conference room at the Education Board headquarters. He'd gone home for a quick shower and change of clothes, but his mind was still back at Rosa's coffee house with Grace and her beautiful drawings. He'd carefully placed each hand-drawn page in a presentation folder, and now, standing before 12 of the most influential education officials in the country, he felt his heart pounding. The board members looked exactly like what you'd expect. Serious faces, expensive suits, tablets and laptops open in front of them. They'd seen hundreds of presentations promising to revolutionize education. They'd learned to be skeptical. Dr. Williams, the board chairwoman, gave him a polite but cool smile. "Mr. Thompson, we've been looking forward to seeing your adaptive learning program. We understand you've been developing it for 3 years. Please begin when you're ready." David took a deep breath. This was it. Everything came down to this moment. "Thank you for being here," he began. "I know you were expecting a standard digital presentation. What I'm about to show you is different. Last night, I lost my presentation file. Everything I'd prepared for 3 years was gone. But sometimes, when we lose what we think we need, we find something better." He saw a few board members exchange glances. They probably thought he was making excuses. "Last night," David continued, "I met a woman named Grace. She runs a small coffee shop, and she has a 13-year-old son with dyslexia. When I told her about my program, she didn't just listen politely. She understood, because she lives this reality every single day. And then she did something extraordinary." David opened the folder and held up the first drawing. It was a portrait of a child's face, split down the middle. On one side, confusion and frustration. On the other, understanding and joy. Below it, Grace had written in beautiful script. Same child. Different approach. The room went completely silent. Every board member leaned forward to see better. For the next 2 hours, David took them through the entire program using Grace's artwork. Each page told a story. Each diagram showed not just data, but the human reality behind that data. Grace had included actual quotes from children in pilot programs. She'd drawn before and after scenarios that made the improvement feel real and tangible. But what really moved the room was how Grace had illustrated the core concept. She'd drawn a series of doors, each one different. Some were tall and narrow. Some were short and wide. Some had handles, some had knobs, some opened by pushing, some by pulling. Above them all, she'd written, "Every child can enter the room of learning. They just need the right door." David explained the technology, the research, the neural learning science behind the program. But Grace's drawings made it mean something. They made it matter. You could see it on the board members' faces. This wasn't just another educational software pitch. This was about real children who were struggling right now, today, in classrooms all across the country. When David reached the final page, there was a drawing of a young boy sitting at a kitchen table, surrounded by books. His mother sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Above them, Grace had written in her own son's handwriting, "I'm not stupid. My brain just works different. And that's okay." David's voice caught as he read those words aloud. "That was written by Daniel, the son of the woman who helped me create this presentation. He's 13. He has dyslexia. And every night, he sits at his kitchen table crying because he thinks he's stupid. But he's not stupid. None of these children are stupid. They just need us to meet them where they are and help them learn in the way their brains are designed to learn." The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Dr. Williams cleared her throat. David couldn't read her expression. Was she moved? Was she skeptical? He had no idea. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, "in 20 years of reviewing educational programs, I have never seen a presentation like this. The science is solid. Your research is thorough. But what makes this special is that you've shown us the heart behind the data. You've reminded us why we're all here in the first place." She looked around at the other board members. Several of them were nodding. One woman was wiping her eyes. "I'd like to propose something," Dr. Williams continued. "Usually, we take several weeks to review and discuss before making a decision. But I think we all know that children like Daniel don't have time to waste. I'd like to call for a preliminary vote right now. We can finalize the details later, but I want to know if this board is ready to approve the pilot program expansion to a national rollout." David's heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone could hear it. One by one, the board members raised their hands. All 12 of them. Unanimous approval. Dr. Williams smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. "Mr. Thompson, congratulations. Your program will begin rolling out to schools nationwide within 6 months. We'll start with districts that have high populations of struggling readers. And Mr. Thompson, please thank Grace for us. Her artwork didn't just illustrate your program. It reminded all of us why we chose to work in education in the first place." David could barely speak. "I will. Thank you. Thank you all." As he left the building, walking out into the bright morning sunshine, David pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed. "Rose's Coffee House, this is Grace." "Grace," David said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "They approved it. Unanimous vote. The program is going nationwide." On the other end of the line, he heard Grace start to cry. "Daniel," she called out. "Honey, come here. I have something to tell you." And David stood there on the steps of the Education Board building, listening to a mother tell her son that help was coming, that he wasn't stupid, that everything was going to be okay. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones we plan. Sometimes they're the ones that come from unexpected helpers in unlikely places at impossible times. You know what I've learned? The best stories don't really end. They just keep growing, spreading out like ripples in water, touching more lives than we ever imagined possible. 3 months after that presentation, David stood in a school gymnasium in a neighborhood much like the one where he grew up. It was the official launch day for Bright Path Learning, and 200 children with dyslexia and their families had gathered to be among the first to try the new program. But David wasn't alone at the front of that gymnasium. Standing beside him was Grace, and next to her was Daniel. David had insisted that Grace be part of the launch. She'd done more than help him recreate a presentation. She'd transformed it into something that could change hearts as well as minds. And she'd done it because she understood from the inside what these families were going through. "I want to introduce you to someone," David said to the crowd. "This is Grace. 3 months ago, I walked into her coffee shop at the worst moment of my life. I'd lost everything I'd worked for, and I had no idea how to fix it. Grace didn't just help me. She reminded me why this program matters. Because it's not about technology or business or success. It's about children who deserve every chance to discover how brilliant they really are. The families applauded, but David could see some of them were confused. They didn't understand yet. Grace has a son named Daniel, David continued. Daniel, would you come up here? Daniel walked to the front, and David could see he was nervous. But there was something else in his eyes now. Something that hadn't been there 3 months ago. Hope. Daniel, David said gently. Do you remember what you told your mom a few months ago? About school? Daniel nodded, his voice quiet but steady. I told her I wanted to quit. I thought I was stupid because I couldn't read like other kids. And now? Daniel looked out at all the families watching him. David could see children of all ages, some confident, some shy, but all of them carrying that same weight of feeling different, feeling broken. Now I know I'm not stupid, Daniel said, and his voice grew stronger. My brain just works different. And that's actually pretty cool. I got to be one of the first kids to test Mr. David's program, and for the first time ever, reading doesn't make me want to cry. It makes me want to keep going. A woman in the third row started crying. Her daughter, who looked about Daniel's age, reached over and squeezed her hand. Grace stepped forward. I spent years watching my son struggle. I spent years feeling helpless, wondering if I was doing something wrong, wondering if there was anything I could do to help him. And then one night, a man walked into my coffee shop at 3 a.m, desperate and lost. And somehow, in helping him, I helped my own son. I helped all of our sons and daughters. She pulled out her old sketchbook. These drawings that helped launch this program, they weren't just about education or science. They were about hope. They were about believing that our children deserve every opportunity to shine in their own unique way. David watched as families came forward after the presentation to try the program themselves. He watched children's faces light up as they realized that learning could actually feel good instead of frustrating. He watched parents cry tears of relief as they saw their kids succeed for maybe the first time ever. But the moment that meant the most came later that evening. David and Grace were packing up equipment when a little girl, maybe 7 years old, tugged on Grace's sleeve. Miss Grace, she said shyly. My name is Lily. I hate reading. It makes my head hurt and my teacher gets mad when I'm slow. Grace knelt down to Lily's level. I know exactly how you feel, sweetie. I felt the same way when I was your age. Really? But you're a grown-up. You can read anything. I can now. But it took me a long time to learn, and I had to learn differently than other kids. And you know what? That's okay. Being different isn't bad. It's just different. Lily thought about this. Will this program really help me? Yes, honey. It really will. Do you know how I know? How? Because it's already helping my son Daniel. And it's going to help thousands of kids just like you and him. Kids who are smart and creative and wonderful, who just need someone to teach them in the right way. Lily smiled, and it was like watching clouds part to let sunshine through. Thank you, Miss Grace. Thank you, Mr. David. As Lily ran back to her parents, David turned to Grace. You know what's amazing? That little girl isn't going to remember this as the day some company launched an educational program. She's going to remember it as the day someone told her she wasn't broken. Grace wiped her eyes. That's what matters most, isn't it? Not the technology or the business success. The moment when a child realizes they're not stupid, they're not broken, they're just different. And different is beautiful. Over the next year, Bright Path Learning reached more than 15,000 schools. Hundreds of thousands of children got access to learning that finally made sense for their brains. Test scores improved. But more importantly, children stopped giving up on themselves. David kept Grace's original drawings framed in his office. But more than that, he hired her as the company's director of family relations. Because who better to help struggling families than someone who had walked that road herself? And Daniel, he started a YouTube channel teaching other kids with dyslexia that they weren't alone. He showed them strategies that worked. He reminded them they were smart and capable and worthy. Sometimes I think about that night in Rosa's coffee house. One man desperate for help. One woman with the skills to give it. Both of them brought together by circumstance and desperation, and maybe something bigger than both of them. That's what I want you to remember from this story. When everything falls apart, when all your plans crumble, when you feel most alone and helpless, that's often exactly when miracles happen. But they don't look like lightning from the sky. They look like kind strangers in coffee shops. They look like skills you forgot you had. They look like two broken people helping each other heal. Grace didn't just help David save his presentation that night. She helped him remember why it mattered. And in doing so, she found her own purpose again too. The most beautiful part? They're still working together, still helping families, still reminding children that different doesn't mean broken. Because that's what real miracles do. They don't just fix one problem. They ripple outward, touching more lives than we can count, healing wounds we didn't even know needed healing. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll remember that you have the power to be someone's miracle too. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, somewhere, someone will desperately need exactly what you have to offer. And when that moment comes, I hope you'll have the courage to say yes. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for believing that kindness matters and that help can come from the most unexpected places. Now go out there and be someone's Grace. Be someone's David. Be the person who shows up at exactly the right moment and changes everything. Because that's how we change the world. One coffee shop conversation at a time. One hand-drawn picture at a time. One child who finally believes they're not stupid at a time. That's how miracles work. They start small. They start with caring. They start with showing up. And they change absolutely everything.